Hello, dear viewers. In this sixth part of our video review, we will show how the Russian-Ukrainian war affected the entire geopolitical balance of power in Europe and the world. In the previous 5 episodes of the video review, we showed how Russia lost all the wars that it started. The only exceptions were those wars where Russia had strong allies from Western countries. Also, in the last part, we carefully examined the Russian-Ukrainian war and its consequences for Ukraine and Russia. We showed how Russia lost 2 more wars at once, while it was fighting against Ukraine and threw all its forces and resources into the war with it. Russia lost Karabakh in Azerbaijan and Syria, because it could not fight on 2 fronts. And in this part, we will show how Russia's defeat in the Russian-Ukrainian war changed the balance of power around Russia and inside Russia. We will show how the Russian-Ukrainian war became a disaster for the Russian Federation, and what wars may await the Russian Federation in the near future. Let's show what Russia has achieved in the Russian-Ukrainian war and what awaits it next. It should be immediately clarified that one of the main reasons for Russia's invasion of neighboring countries was the so-called protection of the Russian or pro-Russian population in these countries. For this purpose, pro-Russian slogans were actively promoted and disseminated in these countries, and pro-Russian activities and propaganda were carried out. Their apogee was the so-called Russian Spring and the Russian world. We have already dealt with them very well and in detail in our previous parts of the video review. Also in its propaganda, Russia began to use the concept of fraternal peoples. These are precisely those peoples who either spoke Russian or were pro-Russian and supported Russia. It was under the slogans of helping the fraternal Russian-speaking population that Russia began to invade such countries. That is, the concept of a fraternal people served as a pretext for the invasion. Apparently, for Russia and Russians, fraternal nations are those that were supposed to be part of the Russian Empire. And if these nations refused, then Russia came to liberate them from their freedom, making them slaves of Moscow again. Therefore, if in Russia some nation is called fraternal, this nation needs to prepare for war as soon as possible. Because soon the Russian army will come to liberate it, it will bring war to this people. This is exactly what happened to most of the so-called fraternal peoples neighboring Russia. Russia and the Russian world brought them only war and destruction. We have analyzed well what the so-called Russian world has brought to countries and peoples in a separate video on the channel, where we have shown well examples of the Russian world. The Russian world is war and only war. This was shown by such examples in which Russia got involved in other countries. There everything ended in war and destruction. As an example, these are Syria, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, Ukraine, and so on. You can watch this in detail. The link to the video is in the description under this video. It must be said that previously, all Russian policy only led to the fact that neighboring countries and peoples began to flee from Russia as far as possible to NATO and the EU. Such a choice of countries was not without reason. So Russia itself created such conditions that neighboring countries began to flee from it. No one wanted to go back to the concentration camp of nations called the USSR or something like that. And the wars unleashed by Russia became the apogee of the desire of neighboring countries to distance themselves from Russia as far as possible. Russia could not create such conditions within its own country that neighboring countries would want the same. Russia could not make neighboring countries themselves reach out to it, as they reach out to the EU and NATO. Russia could not make neighboring countries themselves want to unite with it. But Russia tried to restore the USSR by force. And it succeeded until it started a war with Ukraine. The Russian-Ukrainian war changed everything. Sweden and Finland immediately went to NATO. All other countries started talking about the same. There was no alternative to the EU anymore, especially in conditions when Russia had slid into a harsh totalitarian dictatorship. This means that Russia will face more future wars and conflicts. All those frozen wars that were created with its participation will sooner or later resume. Azerbaijan and Syria have shown that in order to achieve peace, it is necessary to restore their territorial integrity by military means and expel Russia from their territories. They succeeded and the countries became free. Russia can do nothing, since it is bogged down in the Russian-Ukrainian war. This war became the opportunity in which countries could become free and free themselves from Moscow. So Georgia and Moldova will be next in line. Perhaps Chechnya and Dagestan. By the way, between these republics, Russia repeated the experience with Armenia and Azerbaijan. It also took part of Dagestan's territories and transferred them to Chechnya. And no one asked Dagestan's opinion. In general, everything is as was previously done with Nagorno-Karabakh, when it was transferred from Azerbaijan to Armenia. Russia knows that Dagestan and Chechnya can rebel and try to secede from the Russian Federation. Therefore, Russia has already prepared the conditions to prevent this. Of course, if Dagestan wants to leave, then part of its territory will be occupied by Chechnya. And then most likely Russia will have to side with Chechnya and help militarily. If this happens, Dagestan and Chechnya will get a completely 100% similar frozen conflict, which was between Azerbaijan and Armenia. It was possible to resolve it only by military means. And only after the expulsion of the Russian army from there. It was not easy to do. But the Russian-Ukrainian war gave such a chance. While Russia is bogged down in Ukraine, many countries got the opportunity to become free from Moscow. Also, Dagestan and Chechnya can initially prevent the creation of such a military conflict between them. Chechnya can return these territories transferred by Russia back to Dagestan and avoid war. After all, it has a striking example of Karabakh, over which the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia lasted 30 years. In this case, Chechnya and Dagestan may not have territorial disputes and be free and independent from Moscow. And in the same way, if as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian war the collapse of Russia begins or a severe political and economic crisis begins, this will give opportunities not only to neighboring countries to free themselves from Moscow, but also to some republics within the Russian Federation to become free. For example, Dagestan and Chechnya. What will happen if during the internal crisis in Russia, some of its republics want to separate and become independent, declare their withdrawal from the Russian Federation? After all, Chechnya already tried to do this before the collapse of the USSR and immediately after its collapse. And what will happen if at the same time these will be republics neighboring Russia, such as Georgia and Moldova, and Ukraine too? What do you think? Write your opinion in the comments. Well, the source of the crisis in Russia was, of course, the Russian-Ukrainian war. Firstly, the costs of continuing the war hit the Russians hard in the pocket. And secondly, the sanctions for the war unleashed by Russia began to destroy the Russian economy. In this war, Russia has already suffered a defeat and carried out its demilitarization. This means that it will be easier for countries to free themselves from Russian occupation. The Russian army will be very weak for some time, the economy will be destroyed, most likely there will be political instability, etc. In general, these are exactly the conditions under which countries can free themselves from Russian occupation. After all, Russia will not be capable of war anywhere else for a long time. And even more so if there is a war with Ukraine or a frozen war, which can flare up again at any moment, only not at the request of the Kremlin, but at the request of Ukraine, to restore its territorial integrity. In this case, it will be easier for many countries to free themselves, because Russia will throw all its forces at Ukraine. And in the same way, if there is a ceasefire, what guarantee is there that Ukraine will not want to return its territories by force, just like Azerbaijan did with Karabakh? After all, a frozen conflict can always flare up again. It is not a resolved conflict. This means that by freezing the war in Ukraine, Russia itself is becoming a hostage to a new war in the future. But now it may not go according to the Kremlin's plans at all. After all, Ukraine will continue to strengthen itself with Western weapons and arm itself, and Russia will not be able to do anything about it. NATO weapons are much more effective than their Soviet and Russian counterparts, so Russia will lose in a future war and it will no longer be the one dictating the course of the war. In principle, the Russian-Ukrainian war has already proven this. This means that a war with Ukraine deprives Russia of the opportunity to fight somewhere else. This was proven by Syria and the Armenian-Azerbaijani war with Russia's participation. Therefore, any wars of Russia against Ukraine will give other countries and peoples the opportunity to gain their freedom and independence, as well as get rid of Russian occupation. Among such countries may be Moldova with Transnistria, where Russian troops are based. And the country cannot restore its territorial integrity and become free from Moscow because of them. Georgia, where 2 regions are occupied by Russian troops. These are Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And finally, Ukraine itself, where Russia has occupied part of its southeastern territories, including the Crimean Peninsula and part of Donbass, as well as large territories of the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions of Ukraine. And in the same way, Russia now has no time for Kazakhstan. Although earlier its media repeatedly called for the alleged return of part of the northern territories of Kazakhstan to the Russian Federation. It is also important that these territorial claims were made by deputies of the Russian party United Russia, which had a majority in parliament and represented the Russian government. Also, this party was considered the party of dictator Putin. I draw your attention to the fact that these calls began just before Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. That is, apparently, the Russian military planned to quickly seize Ukraine and then turn around and go to Kazakhstan. As a result, annex it completely or partially. Or first partially, and then completely. In this way, Russia planned to restore the Soviet Union or recreate the Russian Empire within its former borders. But Ukraine also ruined all of Moscow's plans, inflicting a crushing defeat on the Russian armies during their invasion. It is also important to emphasize that the main slogans of such a Russian campaign in Kazakhstan were again the Russian language and the fraternal Russian-speaking population of Kazakhstan. That is, as we said earlier, Russia used the concepts of the Russian-speaking population and the concepts of a fraternal people as a pretext for a future invasion and occupation of a neighboring country. In this case, Kazakhstan. And just before the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine, the self-proclaimed authorities of Transnistria in Moldova declared their desire to join the Russian Federation. It is possible that Transnistria was only a pretext for introducing Russian troops into the territory of all of Moldova. Again, under the guise of protecting the Russian-speaking population of the fraternal Moldovan people. This once again confirms the fact that the Kremlin's plans were to quickly subjugate Ukraine and immediately seize and annex other republics of the former USSR. Among them was Moldova. All this is confirmed by another fact. The Russian Federation invaded Ukraine on a full scale and captured large territories of the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions. After that, the Russian authorities declared to the whole world that they do not want and do not plan to annex them to the Russian Federation. The same was stated by the party secretary of the President of the Russian Federation. But Russia is reminiscent of pathological liars. If it says something, it means it will do the opposite. Thus, the State Duma of the Russian Federation will vote a little later for the annexation of 4 regions of Ukraine and include them in the Russian Federation. It is noteworthy that it will do this without even capturing these regions. Moreover, it will do this even despite the fact that the whole world will see how the residents of Kherson and other Ukrainian cities will rise up against the Russian occupation and will deploy Russian troops and drive them out of the city. Nevertheless, Russia will continue to try to annex these regions. And perhaps at first Russia did not plan to annex them, since it planned to capture all of Ukraine. But when the Russian armies were defeated, Russia decided to grab from Ukraine at least what the Russian army had already managed to occupy. But this once again confirms the fact that the Russian Federation had plans to conquer all of Ukraine and not only it, but also other former Soviet republics. Also, another scenario of such annexations was that Russia planned to seize the entire southeast of Ukraine. Again, based on the language principle. Where there was more Russian-speaking, so-called fraternal population, those regions were to be annexed first. And there were more of them in these regions, which had previously elected the constantly pro-Russian party of regions. So when the Russian Federation was defeated near Kiev and in other regions, it decided to concentrate on the southeast of Ukraine. Then, apparently, there were plans to seize, if not all of Ukraine, then at least the southeast of the country. And then, to annex Transnistria with Moldova. And if the Russian Federation did not succeed in this either, then the plans were to seize the southeast on the left bank of Ukraine and prepare for a new war for the entire south of Ukraine. This once again shows that, no matter what the truce, in the future, the Russian Federation will still attack under any pretext. This shows that no matter how much territory Russia conquers in Ukraine, it will never stop until it conquers all of Ukraine, and then the other republics of the former USSR. And this shows that Russia's goal is very simple, to restore the empire. But, as we see, the Russian-Ukrainian war has changed all the Kremlin's imperial ambitions. Without Ukraine, Russia will not be able to restore the Russian Empire, will not be able to restore the USSR. Ukraine is a key element there. But it was able to defend its independence. And now, no matter how the Russian-Ukrainian war ends, with a temporary peace or a truce, the result will be the same as Afghanistan and Western sanctions were for the USSR. Because under sanctions, Russia will not be able to develop, and without a powerful economy, Russia will not be able to conquer neighboring countries and cannot seize Ukraine, it has not been able to. And that means that we can put an end to the restoration of the Russian Empire. One way or another, Ukraine will be in the EU, and it will be a free and independent prosperous country. Ukraine has won this and achieved this in the Russian-Ukrainian war. And what will happen to Russia is a big question. Will it slide even further into totalitarianism and dictatorship? Or will it be able to rebuild itself and become a democratic and developed country? Or will it be absorbed by China after its demilitarization in the Russian-Ukrainian war? Or will it simply fall apart? Time will tell. In any case, the Russian-Ukrainian war has radically changed the Russian Federation itself. And all scenarios for its future development are very problematic precisely because of this war. This war will have catastrophic consequences for the future of Russia itself. But to what extent, time will tell. However, one thing is for sure, that people in Russia will ask the question for a long time. Why did Russia invade Ukraine at all and start a war with it? Because in the future, the consequences of this war for Russia and for the Russian population will be catastrophic. And for Ukraine and Ukrainians, they were left without a choice. They were simply attacked because they wanted to live better and did not want to be slaves of another concentration camp of peoples, which the USSR was for them earlier. Incidentally, like many peoples neighboring Russia, as well as peoples inside the Russian Federation. At the same time, the sanctions of the West and developed countries of the world against the Russian Federation, as well as the beginning of Russia's isolation, called into question all its further development. And in the same way, the breakdown of cooperation with Ukraine led to the collapse of entire sectors of the Russian Federation's industry, including the military. Many types of products, both under the USSR and after its collapse, were produced only in Ukraine. Or they depended on supplies of Ukrainian components or specialists. And often, Ukrainian manufacturers were the only monopolists of certain products in the entire post-Soviet space. The Russian Federation was completely dependent on it and could not replace it. After 2014, Russia began to replace Ukrainian products with Western ones, but after the invasion of 2022, Western sanctions deprived it of this opportunity. Entire sectors of industry were unable to produce modern products, and very often products of ancient Soviet models. In general, in such conditions, the Russian industry degraded. And Russia turned into a raw materials appendage. At the same time, in the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war, the Russian Federation has not achieved any goals. On the contrary, it suffered crushing losses, carried out its demilitarization and suffered defeat. In fact, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was the beginning of the end of the Russian Federation. Therefore, time will tell whether the Russian Federation will be able to avoid repeating the fate of the USSR. Especially in conditions when it is still unknown how China will behave. The Russian Federation, which is at war with Ukraine, has become completely dependent on it. Look, the Russian Federation has carried out its demilitarization in the Russian-Ukrainian war. It has even reached the point where the Russian army has massively switched from armored vehicles to old motorcycles. Now these are the same meaty assaults of the Russians, only this time on motorcycles. It has become very problematic for Russia to produce new equipment and weapons under sanctions. It has become completely dependent on Chinese machine tools and equipment. That is, it has fallen into complete dependence. The Russian economy is supported only by oil purchases by China and India. At the same time, China is practically buying up Russian resources for next to nothing and renting land on the territory of the Russian Federation. Thus, one day, the Russians may wake up and find themselves in China. This is with a smooth annexation. But can China miss such a chance when Russia will have nothing to respond with in the event of its military invasion? Before 2014, China could not even dream of such conditions. After all, in the event of the annexation of Siberia, the whole world would be against China. And Europe, and the USA, and all NATO and most countries of the world. They would start helping Russia to repel aggression. And on the contrary, China would fall into international isolation. In addition, before the war with Ukraine, Russia had huge arsenals of weapons and equipment inherited from the USSR. And what happened after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022? Russia was defeated and by 2025 had carried out its demilitarization. How will Russia respond to China? It will simply have nothing to fight with in this case. And Europe, the USA, and NATO will not help. Since Russia issued an ultimatum to NATO and threatened war before invading Ukraine. It wanted NATO to roll back to the borders as far as Germany. That is, Russia wanted to restore its empire, and if Ukraine was defeated, it would annex the Baltic countries, start aggression against Poland, and so on. But the defeat of the Russian Federation in Ukraine changed these plans. And NATO realized that this was aggression not only against Ukraine, it was aggression against all of Europe and NATO. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, who started helping Ukraine? Europe and the USA, as well as other countries of the world. Therefore, in the event of an attack by China, the West will not help Russia. It considers it an aggressor-occupier. At least in the first months of the war. And this will be more than enough for China. But if earlier Russia always took the lead in wars, used bloody assaults, then this will not work against China. Because China has many times more troops. It can attack and take the lead itself. And then Russia will ask for help from Ukraine, the USA, Europe, and generally from all countries of the world. But as it becomes clear, such a scenario was possible only after Russia is demilitarized and when it is in confrontation with Western countries, so that they cannot help it. All this has already been achieved in the Russian-Ukrainian war. But the best scenario for China would be a clash between the Russian Federation and the EU. For example, Russia's invasion of Lithuania, Finland, Poland, etc. To finally drive Russia and Europe apart. To implement such a scenario, China could promise Russia a lot. For example, start supplying weapons to Russia or introduce its troops into Russian territory to support it. But to promise does not mean to fulfill. Moreover, what guarantee is there that China will not introduce its troops to help against Europe, and then not go to Europe, but occupy Russia? In this case, it would be able to occupy Russian territory without hindrance and then simply refuse to withdraw its troops. In fact, this would be an annexation. But this is just a version. One of the possible scenarios. And another scenario is a real clash with NATO. In this case, the war will no longer be on the territory of the EU, but on the territory of Belarus and Russia. Because NATO armies in Europe are much more powerful than the Russian army. Before the Russian-Ukrainian war, many in the world believed that the Russian army was very strong and second only to the United States. In Russia itself, propaganda constantly pointed out that the Russian army is the second army in the world. They meant in terms of strength. But the Russian-Ukrainian war dispelled this myth. Ukraine was able to stop the Russian army and defeat it. The Russian army was forced to leave 2/3 of the territories it had previously captured. The Ukrainian army was able to localize the Russian army in Donbass. The entire offensive of the Russian army was reduced to battles for villages and small towns. And the price of such minor advances was the loss of hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers. Ukraine has shown that it is stronger. As U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, I quote, "The Kremlin has often stated that it has the second most powerful army in the world, and many believed it. Now many see that the Russian army is the second most powerful in Ukraine." At the same time, Ukraine almost did not have the main component of any army, its aviation. It was the aviation that became the main force in the Second World War. And since then, all victories have been achieved in the sky. There is even a proverb that goes like this: whoever wins in the sky, wins in war. So Ukraine had almost no aviation and Russia still could not capture the country. And NATO aviation is many times, if not orders of magnitude more powerful than Russia's. At the time of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russian aviation numbered about 500 fighters. Moreover, approximately 70% of them were ancient Soviet fighters. Most of them could not even take off. And there was no talk at all about performing a combat mission. That is, only about 300 fighters could take off. And much less could perform a combat mission. At the same time, the number of Russian fighters lost in Ukraine is in the hundreds. In total, Russia lost about 450 aircraft in Ukraine over 3.5 years of war. But these are not only fighters, these are also attack aircraft, bombers, transport aircraft, etc. But the lost fighters were the newest ones, those that could still take off and perform combat missions. At the same time, only in the territory of European NATO countries, as of 2020, there were about 2,000 to 2,200 fighters. Also, in 2019 to 2020, European countries began purchasing American fifth-generation F-35 fighters. The contracts provided for the purchase of about 500 fighters until 2025 to 2026. That is, by 2025, European countries could have a total of at least 2.5 thousand interceptors. To be more precise, approximately 2,700 to 2,800 fighters. This is subject to the decommissioning of earlier Tornado fighters. If they were not decommissioned, then the fleet of European interceptors could be up to 3,000 fighters. The United States also had about 200 aircraft in Europe. Together with them, this is already 3,200 fighters. It is also necessary to take into account the fact that we have counted interceptor fighters or multi-role fighters that can be used to intercept enemy aircraft. That is, to gain superiority in the sky. It is also necessary to take into account that the United States can at any time strengthen its air component in Europe, if necessary. This means that there can be many more NATO fighters in Europe. As the facts show, only Europe surpasses the Russian Federation in the number of fighters by an order of magnitude. That is, more than 10 times. At the same time, European fighters are in much better condition. And Europe has many more new fighters than the Russian Federation. And we are counting this with the fighters that the Russian Federation had before the Russian-Ukrainian War. And in it, it lost another 100 to 200 of its newest and most combat-ready fighters. And if since 2022 the fleet of interceptors in the Russian Federation has decreased, then in Europe, on the contrary, it has increased significantly. This means that in terms of the number of fighters, Europe wins over the Russian Federation by approximately 10 to 15 times. Moreover, about 500 of them are fifth-generation F-35 fighters purchased by Europe. It turns out that Europe has more fifth-generation fighters than the total number of fourth-generation fighters that the Russian Federation had before the full-scale Russian-Ukrainian War. And what's more, there are far fewer Russian aircraft after Russian losses in it. It turns out that NATO has total superiority in the sky. And not only there. After all, the Russian-Ukrainian War showed that Soviet and Russian weapons have very low combat effectiveness compared to NATO weapons. NATO has more modern and technologically advanced weapons and military equipment. They often surpass any Soviet and Russian analogues in combat effectiveness by several times. Also, all Soviet and Russian armored vehicles are practically disposable. Because they have very thin armor. They cannot withstand mine explosions, and they cannot withstand hits from most drones. Tanks are easily penetrated by Western shells. And light armored vehicles can be penetrated even by small arms. It is not for nothing that Soviet and Russian troops always sat not inside such armored vehicles, but on top of their armor. This was the case in Afghanistan, Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, Ukraine, etc. Because the armor is very thin, and when driving over a mine, the vehicle is torn to pieces. And on top of the armor, the infantry is much better protected. Thin armor also cannot protect such armored vehicles from small arms, large caliber machine guns, and shrapnel from exploding land mines. Therefore, both inside and outside, the crew and troops were not protected. Therefore, the troops most often moved on top of the armor. At least there was some protection from mines. At the same time, the war in Ukraine showed that the American M2 Bradley, German Marder, Swedish CV-90 and other armored vehicles of Western countries protect their crew and troops well and reliably from mines. They also protect well from fragments of high explosive ammunition that exploded somewhere near the vehicle. They also protect from large caliber bullets, and often from rapid-fire guns of 20 to 30 mm caliber. Very often, the thick combined armor of these vehicles withstood hits from RPGs and ATGMs. There were also drone hits, and the crew and troops remained intact. That is, the trap equipment showed itself from the best side. For example, Ukrainian troops could not normally counterattack on Soviet and Russian equipment. On disposable equipment with thin armor, this was very difficult. And only the receipt of Western armored vehicles of the MRAP class gave the Ukrainian army the opportunity to effectively counterattack. These machines made a huge contribution to the counteroffensive in the Kharkov region, when almost half of the region was liberated from the Russian occupier. In the future, it was Western equipment and weapons that would enable the Ukrainian army to effectively defend itself and stop the more numerous Russian army. Russia had many more tanks and combat armored vehicles. But the Ukrainian army already had more combat-ready Western equipment, albeit in much smaller quantities. But this made it possible to stop the aggressor and prevent it from capturing Ukraine. It was on the battlefield that it became clear that Western military equipment and weapons are much more effective than their Russian counterparts. The same applies to aircraft. Therefore, if a war broke out between Europe and Russia, the Russian Federation has no chance at all. European armies would crush the Russian army like a cockroach and would not notice. Russia could not cope with Ukraine, which was armed to a large extent with Soviet weapons, and with the receipt of Western weapons, it was able to effectively hold off the much superior forces of the Russian invasion. And what can we say then about European countries, which are armed only with high-quality Western equipment and weapons? Moreover, Europe also has a lot of these weapons. Europe helped Ukraine, but did it in a way that did not reduce its own security. Europe began to arm itself, put its economy on a war footing. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it became clear that it was not only Russia that was waging the war, China was behind it. Therefore, Europe began to arm itself not against a demilitarized Russia. It began to arm itself against China. Because no one knows how China will behave. If it wants to capture Russia, then it is unknown where it will stop. Maybe in the Urals, or maybe it will go further all the way to the EU borders. And their NATO countries will have to fight not with a technically backward Russia, but with a more developed China, which already has a fifth-generation fighter. And the largest army in the world. So Europe is in a hurry to arm itself not against the Russian Federation, but exclusively against China. Russia is not an enemy for Europe at all. For example, Ukraine, having no fleet, was able to destroy almost the entire Black Sea fleet of the Russian Federation. All its main ships were shot down or sank. And the remaining fleet was relocated from Crimea to the eastern part of the Black Sea in Novorossiysk, mainly away from Ukrainian missiles and drones. And in the same way, Ukraine had almost no aviation, but was able to close its skies to Russian aircraft. Control of the sky remained with Ukraine. That is, Ukraine was able to cope with Russia and was able to stop its offensive. The entire Russian-Ukrainian war has been reduced to battles for villages and small towns. For example, the entire year of 2024, and now it is August 2025, and Russia is still moving towards the city of Pokrovsk. It began moving from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk in February 2024. And the battle for Pokrovsk continues in August 2025. The distance between these cities is approximately 30 kilometers in a straight line. That is, Russia has been advancing on these 30 kilometers for almost 2 years. And the width of the front there is also small. Somewhere also 30 kilometers. That is, it is a local deepening. And during all this time, Russia has already lost about 400,000 of its troops there. Only on this piece of 900 square kilometers. These are simply unthinkable losses. Russia lost 300,000 troops on this narrow section of the front in 2024, another 100,000 in the first half of 2025. Also, in midsummer 2025, the Russian Federation concentrated impressive forces to capture this city. Russia concentrated more than 100 troops around Pokrovsk. These are incredibly large forces. And all this is only for one small city of Pokrovsk, which the Russian army could not take for a year and a half. Since February 2024. In such offensives, the Russian Federation suffered staggering losses. The Russian army lost at least 1,000 of its troops per day throughout 2024 and 2025. The main losses were in the Pokrovsk direction. There, Russia advanced with its meaty assaults, but in a year and a half it was still unable to capture the city. That is, in order to capture such a small city, Russia can lose 500,000 of its troops. This is as much as, for example, the United States lost in the Second World War on all fronts for all the years of the war. There were more than 400,000 troops there. And here Russia has already lost 400,000 soldiers in 1.5 years of the battle for the city of Pokrovsk. At the same time, the battle for the city continues, and how much more Russia will lose in this direction, time will tell. This shows that the Russian army has long since lost its combat capability and now attacks only through meaty assaults, sending its infantry to be slaughtered. Just like in the proverb, it is trying to throw hats at them. So, in case of war with Europe, it will not be possible to throw hats at 140 million people in Russia against 500 million population of Europe. Moreover, as we found out, the weapons of European countries significantly exceed Russian analogues. Plus, the Europeans have a large air force and navy. By the way, we have counted only European countries. And then there is the USA, whose army, air force, and navy are no smaller than in Europe, and even larger. So Russia is not an enemy for NATO at all. The same applies to the economy. 1 to 1.5% of the world's gross domestic product, which falls to Russia against approximately 70% of the GDP, which falls to NATO countries and, in general, democratic countries of the world. Therefore, NATO and the EU are clearly not preparing for a war with Russia. They are preparing for a clash with China, the GDP of which is approximately 20% of the total world. And this is already a serious enemy, unlike the Russian Federation. There is a scenario that China and Russia, as well as Iran and the DPRK, could start a war against NATO. Russia in Europe, and China against the US in the Pacific Ocean. But this scenario has already completely failed as a result of Russia's defeat in Ukraine. What kind of war with Europe is there if Russia was unable to capture Ukraine alone? And which, at the time of the invasion, was armed with ancient Soviet technology and weapons. Perhaps Russia planned to seize Ukraine and reach the borders of NATO and start a war with Europe. Then the United States would have to help the Europeans, and China could begin an invasion of Taiwan. The United States would then have to fight on two fronts. On the one hand, help the Europeans in Europe, and on the other hand, help China in the Pacific Ocean. But Russia's defeat in Ukraine led to the opposite effect. If China plans a war with NATO, then now it would have to fight on two fronts. Send some troops to help Russia against Europe, and send some troops against the United States in the Pacific region. In this case, China will have a much harder time. Especially against Europe and the United States, which have embarked on a war footing and have begun to sharply increase the production of weapons and military equipment. The militarization of Western countries has begun. So the scenario in which China is preparing for war with NATO is unlikely. After all, NATO has more modern and combat-ready weapons than China. China's weapons were mainly based on copying Soviet types of weapons and equipment. But they turned out to be less combat-ready than NATO standard weapons. Therefore, China must understand that it is far inferior to the West in terms of quality. At the same time, the West is actively strengthening its army. Also, China does not have a numerical superiority over the West. Everything is simple there. The population of China is approximately 1.5 billion people. The population of Europe is 500 million, the United States has about 400 million. There is also Japan with 120 million and a large number of democratic countries that will support NATO. Australia, South Korea, countries of Asia and the Middle East, Africa, South America, and so on. So China does not have a significant advantage in soldiers. But there is a strong lag in the quality of weapons. So what is the point of starting a war against a stronger enemy? And the same is true for the economy. Democratic countries and NATO countries in total greatly surpass China economically. Chinese manufacturers are trying to obtain US and European technology to produce modern goods in China. That is, China depends on the West. And in the same way, the main markets for Chinese products are in Europe and the United States. This means that China also depends on the West. If we start a war with the West, we can lose Western technologies and Western markets for our products. This means a crisis in China's economy. It is even possible that it will experience political instability and even collapse. Why does China need this? On the contrary, China wants to deepen trade with Europe, the USA and, in general, with countries around the world. This means that China's goal is clearly not a clash with Europe and the USA. China is too weak for this. Russia cannot support it. It has merged in the Russian-Ukrainian war. How can it compete with the EU and NATO? This means that China needs to seriously strengthen itself for a possible confrontation. But how? It is simple, it can plan to do this at the expense of Russia. At the expense of Russian territories. Perhaps China's goal may be Russian Siberia and the Far East. In this way, China can obtain enormous resources and its influence in the world will greatly increase. In this case, China can try to confront the West economically, through production and trade, as well as through the supply of resources. And then it will not need a military confrontation with NATO. Then it will influence the world economically. Maybe this is China's goal? If so, then Russia has done everything on its part to provide China with such an opportunity. Demilitarization has been carried out, Russia has quarreled with Western countries, threatened them with war. These are very favorable conditions for China to begin annexing Siberia. If China succeeds, it will control at least half of Eurasia. And if it goes further into the European part of Russia, then even more. And here, powerful Europe and the United States must be ready, if necessary, to stop China by force. Perhaps, it is precisely against China that Europe and the United States have begun to hastily arm themselves. As we can see, any of these scenarios is extremely negative for the Russian Federation. After all, if this is a war with Europe, it does not matter with China or without it, but the battles will now be on Russian territory, where Europe will advance. This means that Russia will be completely destroyed. And in the same way, if this is an invasion by China, the entire war will now again be on Russian territory. In such a scenario, the West, albeit not immediately, will begin to help Russia, in order to prevent the Chinese army from reaching its borders. In this way, Russia will fight against China with Western weapons. But if the supplies do start, they will not start immediately, since Europe will not be able to start supplying them immediately to the aggressor from whom Ukraine and all of Europe were recently defended. As we can see, Russia's main problem was that it started a war against Ukraine and quarreled with Western countries, which had saved Russia many times over the centuries. And, in particular, the entire 20th century. This especially applies to the USA, Great Britain, and France. Only due to these countries, Russia still exists in the form in which everyone knows it. The USA saved it at the beginning of the last century, when they did not allow Japan to conquer the entire Russian Far East. Then Western countries saved Russia in the First World War, where the Russian Empire managed to capitulate to Germany and Austria-Hungary. It was saved from defeat by Germany in the Second World War, and brought out the winners due to Lend-Lease supplies and the capitulation of Germany. Finally, after the defeat of the USSR in the Cold War and its collapse, the West did not let Russia fall apart. It helped with food when Russia was actually experiencing a famine. It also helped financially and economically. Although it could have left Russia in isolation, and most likely, it would have further fallen apart. And now Russia has actually started a new Cold War again by invading Ukraine and making military threats against the EU and NATO countries. Now Russia's isolation has begun again, which is beneficial for China. It must be said that Russia is rolling into an economic abyss. A crisis in the Russian Federation is already inevitable. And it does not matter whether the war in Ukraine ends or not. What is important is that now, in any case, some countries will be freed from Russian occupation. Even if we do not take into account all the military scenarios in the world, Russia is in for a very catastrophic scenario. For example, if Russia avoids a clash with the EU and NATO. If China does not attack Russia. Even if all the scenarios are without large-scale wars, the Russian-Ukrainian war will still be a disaster for Russia. Because for the war unleashed and military threats to European countries, sanctions, and isolation of Russia by the international community will continue. Russia will continue to be isolated until it withdraws all its troops from Ukraine. Or until Ukraine forcibly liberates all its territories from the Russian occupier. In general, while the internationally recognized territories of Ukraine are under Russian occupation, it will continue to remain isolated under sanctions. Even if the sanctions are not strengthened, those that have already been introduced will not allow Russia to develop normally. It will continue to degrade, which may end for it in popular upheavals, internal instability, revolution, and even collapse. As we can see, the war in Ukraine has led Russia to negative scenarios. Whichever one it takes, it will have negative consequences for the Russian Federation. But this was the choice of Russia and its people, the government that they supported. And this is the price for the war unleashed against Ukraine. Russia tried to destroy and annihilate Ukraine, and in the end, it destroyed and annihilated itself. It is only a matter of time. And just like that, Europe was heavily disarming before the Russian-Ukrainian war. The US withdrew its last tanks from Europe. The military presence in Europe as a whole was also being reduced. NATO was disarming and seemed about to cease to exist altogether. After all, there were no opponents and it seemed that large wars were no longer possible in the modern civilized world. But as it turned out, it only seemed that way. The Russian-Ukrainian war changed everything. US tanks returned to Europe, and countries began to increase their armies. Before the war, NATO countries had to allocate up to 2.5% of their gross domestic product for defense. But there were practically no such countries in Europe. The military budgets of many European countries amounted to 0.5 to 0.8% of GDP, gross domestic product. Rarely did anyone have a higher figure. Europe hoped for its powerful ally, the US, whose army was the most powerful in the world. And it seemed that Europe was not in danger. But after Russia invaded Ukraine, European countries realized that they were wrong. While NATO was disarming in Europe, Russia did nothing but arm itself year after year. Then it began to threaten NATO, and then it invaded Ukraine. Europe realized that now no country is safe from a Russian invasion. And the US is more busy with the Pacific region, where a clash with China is possible, for example, over Taiwan. As a result, the countries decided to cancel their disarmament and became wary of Russia and its aggression against its neighbors. But even in such conditions, Europe was in no hurry to arm itself. Apparently, it still hoped for its main military ally, the United States. And no one believed in a war with China, as well as in a larger war in Europe. But the invasion of Russian orcs into Ukraine in 2022 changed everything. Firstly, the Russian Federation started a full-scale war, and also threatened Europe with war. Secondly, everyone knew that Ukraine was only the first step, and the European countries followed. Everyone also understood that China was behind Russia's aggression. It was with its consent that the Russian Federation began this adventure. China also constantly supported Russia in international politics. It took Russia's side. The United States was more busy with China and the Pacific region. Therefore, Europe had to take care of itself. That is how Europe began to prepare for war. There are two enemies in the world, one of which has already committed aggression in Europe. The second could at any moment begin to act in the Pacific theater of possible military actions. For example, during the invasion of Taiwan. For the first time since the end of World War II, Russia decided to change the borders of countries by force. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was barbaric. It even went as far as genocide. All following the example of Hitler in World War II. All this was seen en masse by the entire world after the liberation of the suburbs of Kiev by the Ukrainian army. Cities such as Irpin, Bucha, Gostomel, etc. Then it turned out that all this was of a mass nature and was practically everywhere where the Russian army was advancing. It was then that Russian troops began to call the invasion of wild orcs into Ukraine. It became clear to everyone that it is impossible to negotiate with barbarians. They only understand force. As a result, the Europeans began to increase their military budgets, began to restore the military industry and increase their armies. Military spending by countries began to grow sharply. And in 2025, the EU countries pledged to increase their military budgets to 5% of GDP. The United States also began to increase its spending. In fact, the Second Cold War began in the world. By the way, in which Russia has already lost. It is a matter of time. And its result will be Russia's withdrawal from Ukraine. And also a possible repetition of the events with the USSR in 1991, when it collapsed. By the way, it is during political instability or a change of power in the territory of the Russian Federation that China may begin the annexation of Siberia. This is the most advantageous moment. Because during a change of power, it is unlikely that anyone will dare to give the order to use nuclear weapons. And besides, China also has nuclear weapons. So in Russia there simply may not be anyone who will take responsibility for starting a nuclear war. And in general, when there is political instability and a change of power in the country, this is the most vulnerable moment. Take Ukraine. Russia attacked and occupied Crimea and started the war in Donbass precisely during the revolution in Ukraine. Although if there had been an order to shoot to kill, Russia would not have risked seizing Crimea. Which became known later. Russian troops received an order that if the Ukrainian army began shooting and resisting, they were ordered to retreat immediately. Because Russia was afraid of prematurely provoking a war. But during the revolution in Ukraine, for some reason no one could give such an order to the Ukrainian border guards and military. Apparently, they were afraid that a war would start. And this was a big mistake. Since the successful capture of Crimea, practically without a single shot, prompted the Russian leadership to go further. Donbass followed Crimea. And there the shooting began and the war began. As a result, the irresponsibility of the Ukrainian leadership led to both Ukraine losing Crimea and the Russian-Ukrainian war. As we can see, the policy of appeasement led to more serious consequences. And everything could have been stopped in Crimea. Leave the peninsula under Ukrainian control and avoid the Russian-Ukrainian war. For this, there had to be a clear political and military decision to give immediate armed resistance to any aggressor at the slightest manifestation of aggression on their part. And especially in the event of a violation of the state border. But for this, a competent and responsible leadership of the country and the military was needed. And since post-Soviet models were in effect in Ukraine and Russia, including in the security agencies, all the military were waiting for orders from above. The military leadership was absolutely incompetent. It could only wait for orders and was afraid to take any action without them. This is what happened in the case of the Chinese army invading Siberia during political instability in the Russian Federation. While they are dealing with internal problems, China can take advantage of this. Not to mention the fact that China can use the same methods as the Russian Federation in Ukraine. Namely, start a hybrid war from the beginning. When the Chinese military enters the territory of the Russian Federation as civilians. And one day, the Russians will wake up in a different country, where the flag of the PRC will hang. These are just versions, maybe one of them will come true, maybe it will be their symbiosis. But whatever happens, one thing is obvious. All these scenarios are negative for the Russian Federation. And all this was the result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If Russia had not carried out this invasion, then Europe and Ukraine would have continued to disarm. NATO's role would have diminished to the point of complete cessation of this bloc. And China would not even risk invading Siberia. The same applies to attempts to return Taiwan by force. Countries would have continued to develop their economies. But it can be said without exaggeration that Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed the entire world. Everyone realized that no one is insured against such invasions. And only one's own nuclear weapons or membership in a large military bloc, such as NATO, can protect against them. Well, the beginning of the Second Cold War in the world is also a direct result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As well as further scenarios for the Russian Federation. As for Ukraine, Europe and democratic countries of the world will help Ukraine. As a result, it will definitely become a member of the EU. It is possible to restore nuclear weapons in Ukraine. since even NATO membership does not guarantee against Russian invasion. A simple example. Let's consider this scenario. Russia begins an invasion of Lithuania or Poland, or any other country in the Baltic region. It could be Finland, for example. But let's assume that it is Lithuania and the Russian Federation is trying to cut a land corridor from Belarus to Kaliningrad. The invasion begins. Active military actions are underway on the territory of Lithuania. Part of Lithuania falls under Russian control. In the worst-case scenario for Lithuania, it all falls under occupation. Russia threatens Europe with nuclear weapons if it intervenes. So it hopes that Europe will shudder and will not help Lithuania, fearing the start of a nuclear war. But European countries also have nuclear weapons. They decide to protect Lithuania. And they themselves threaten Russia with a nuclear response. As a result, everything comes down to conventional weapons. That is, without nuclear weapons. Then the European countries come to the rescue, defeat the Russian army and liberate Lithuania from the Russian occupier. Then no one attacks anyone. Everyone is afraid to start using nuclear weapons. The most the Europeans can do is push the Russian army away from the borders with Lithuania and create a buffer zone there, so that Russia cannot continue to shell Lithuania with artillery, for example. And even if the war ends there, Lithuania in this case remains in ruins. The second scenario. Russia begins its invasion of Lithuania, but the defense in Lithuania withstands the onslaught of the Russian armies. It manages to hold out until the main forces of the Europeans arrive. Even if Lithuania withstands the attack and repulses the invasion, its territories will still remain in ruins. After all, Russia uses artillery and air bombardment. This means that NATO allies can ensure the territorial integrity of the country. But they cannot ensure security from the invasion and destruction of the aggressor. This gives an understanding that only our own nuclear weapons can protect against this. For example, if Lithuania had nuclear weapons, the Russian leadership would never have risked attacking at all. Because they would have known that in the event of an attack, the response would be too destructive. For example, a nuclear strike on Moscow or St. Petersburg. These are incomparable losses and destruction, which the Kremlin would never agree to. Therefore, there would be no war or invasion. Therefore, nuclear weapons are a real guarantee of the security of any country. And even better, this is both participation in a military bloc and the presence of nuclear weapons. For example, if Ukraine had left at least 100 to 200 nuclear warheads during its nuclear disarmament, the Russian Federation would never have invaded Ukraine. It would have known all the possible consequences. And the same membership of Ukraine in NATO would have given at least some guarantees for the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And so, Ukraine's neutral status contributed to only one thing: an attack by Russia. Which it did in 2014 and then in 2022. And now Russia is again demanding Ukraine's neutral status in order to attack it again in the future. Before Russia's invasion in 2014, Ukraine was a non-aligned country according to its constitution and had the Budapest Memorandum. And what did this neutral status of Ukraine lead to? Russia attacked, started a war and occupied Ukrainian territory. And now it wants Ukraine to become neutral again? But this is not a joke. Russia really does demand that Ukraine be neutral. Only now everyone in the world understands why it demands this. In order to attack again. And no other way. Ukraine understands this, so there will be no peace with Russia without guarantees for Ukraine. Ukraine ensures the security of the entire EU. It is no secret that the EU countries knew that after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they were next in line. Therefore, Europe's security lies in the hands of Ukraine. And Europe will defend Ukraine and help it as best it can. And this means that Russia itself pushed Ukraine into the arms of the EU and NATO. Otherwise, Ukraine will resume its nuclear status. There are simply no other options for protecting Ukraine. Either the EU and NATO, or the restoration of the nuclear status. All of these options will not allow Russia to attack Ukraine in the future. Therefore, these options are categorically rejected by Moscow. And that means the war continues. After all, Russia is thinking only about another future invasion of Ukraine. But this does not suit either Ukraine or Europe. But there is another option, which could suit everyone. That is if Russia liberates the south of Ukraine. Even if this is not a return to pre-war positions, Russia will have to return most of the territories it captured. All of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. The part of Donbass that Russia was unable to capture will also remain with Ukraine. After all, it will be difficult to explain to residents that they must leave their homes because Russia wanted it that way. In this case, Russia will receive almost the entire Luhansk region and almost the entire Donetsk region. And earlier, Russia controlled about a third of Donetsk and a third of Luhansk regions. So it will increase the territories it controls in Ukraine threefold. For Russia, this is a big win. It will control almost the entire Donbass. Russia will also retain control over the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea that it occupies. At the same time, Russia will have to completely withdraw from the south of Ukraine. This does not mean that Ukraine will give up its territories. This will not happen. This is contrary to international law. And the world will never recognize this. But Russia can continue to control part of the Ukrainian territories. They will continue to be considered illegally occupied by Russia. But Russia will have to return most of them in order to conclude a truce. This will be Ukraine's main guarantee against future invasion. There are practically no other options left. For example, if Russia attacks again, it will have to seize these regions again. And there it will receive a tough rebuff. Then there will be peace again and Russia will have to leave these regions again. No one will ever accept the occupation of new regions in Ukraine. Everyone will force it to go to its original pre-war positions. Because giving up new territories to the aggressor will mean encouraging it and will give it an incentive for further aggression. Therefore, Russia will be forced to return everything that it will try to seize again. And this will go on ad infinitum. Therefore, Russia will have no reason to attack again. And perhaps such an option would suit Ukraine and Europe. Moreover, European peacekeepers could be on the demarcation line of the front and control the front line. Perhaps this is the only option for a truce. It can be said unequivocally that neither Ukraine nor Europe will agree to the occupation of all the territories seized by Russia and the war will continue. Because Europe understands well that Ukraine is too big a country and Russia cannot swallow it at once. This was proven by Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And the Russian leadership understands this perfectly well. Therefore, everyone understands that since Russia cannot seize Ukraine entirely, it will try to do it gradually, piece by piece. Everything is like it was in 2014. First, Russia seized part of Donbass and Crimea. And signed the peace. Did not return the territories. So they became a springboard for Russia's further invasion deep into Ukraine. However, now Russia had to seize less. For example, if Russia had been forced to leave Crimea then in the next invasion it would have had to seize Crimea again. And since Ukraine signed the Minsk agreements and went for peace, leaving Russia control over Crimea, now Russia had to seize less. Now it attacked further from occupied Crimea to Kherson and the Zaporizhzhia region. Therefore, it can be assumed that if the left bank parts of the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions are given to Russia for its control, then Russia's next attack will be from them on Nikolaev and Odessa. And also on Zaporizhzhia, Dnieper, and Kharkov. Then Russia will seize some regions and demand peace again. And after a short truce and preparation, it will attack again and again will bite off Ukrainian territories piece by piece until there is no Ukraine left at all. Therefore, stopping the war is no longer in the interests of either Ukraine or Europe. Otherwise, it will only get worse. Ukraine will have much fewer resources for defense. Therefore, in order to stop the war, Ukraine will have to continue fighting. If we pause and call a truce, then in a few years there will be an even bloodier war. Only Ukraine will be in worse conditions. Its capabilities will be much less. And then, this will happen again and again. Until Ukraine is gone altogether. Therefore, Ukraine has no options left. Either fight until all or most of the Ukrainian territories are liberated, or Russia itself will have to liberate them in order to stop the war. Perhaps to freeze it again. Russia is also exhausted by the war and cannot continue it. The same applies to Ukraine. But Ukraine has no choice, its survival as a state and a people, is at stake. In addition, the entire democratic world is helping Ukraine. Countries are helping Ukraine economically and militarily. Ukraine is being militarized. At the same time, Russia's demilitarization is getting worse every day. In fact, stopping the war is only possible when Russia finally empties all the weapons depots it inherited from the USSR. Also, when countries like North Korea and Belarus also exhaust their stockpiles of weapons and ammunition and will not be able to help Russia in its war against Ukraine. Only the demilitarization of Russia will force it to make peace and stop its offensive in Ukraine. And this has already actually happened in 2025. A clear indicator of this is the Russian military, who, instead of infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers and armored cars, began to use motorcycles. Weapons on the territory of the Russian Federation are running out. The Russian army is losing the ability to advance even through massive meat assaults. The level of losses of the Russian army increased almost twofold from year to year. This was the result of demilitarization in equipment and weapons. The less weapons and armored vehicles Russia had, the more losses it suffered in the infantry. So demilitarization in equipment directly proportionally affected the increase in losses of Russian soldiers. Earlier, in 2024, there was already a massive use of civilian cars Shigali, Moskvich, UAZ Bukhanka, and others, hung with armor. All this was only because the Russian army did not have enough armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, armored cars, etc. The Russian military was forced to go into battle on such scrap metal. Otherwise, Russia would have to stop its offensive and capture new Ukrainian territories. The losses of the Russian army, using such cars instead of armored vehicles, increased significantly. But this was not the limit. Because later, instead of armored vehicles, the Russian army began to receive motorcycles. All this is the result of Russia's demilitarization from the Soviet legacy of weapons. All over Russia, people began to collect ancient motorcycles like these for the army. They hung them with anti-drone mesh screens. In this way, even with an acute shortage of combat armored vehicles and tanks, the Russian army tried to continue its assaults and offensive in Ukraine. Consequently, the losses of the Russian Federation increased even more, compared to previous years. But Russia refused to stop the offensive, which again stalled. But at the cost of increasing the losses of its soldiers, Russia tried to continue the offensive, using infantry with motorcycles. So, the Russian army massively switched from armored vehicles to motorcycles. And what will happen when they run out? The answer is simple. First, the offensive will stop, and then the Russian army will be defeated in Ukraine. After all, Ukraine, on the contrary, is receiving more and more weapons from NATO countries. These countries have embarked on a war footing and have begun to increase the supply of weapons and equipment to Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine has fewer soldiers, a smaller army, but it is better equipped and has a higher combat capability. It was demilitarization and the lack of ability to advance and seize new Ukrainian territories, as well as the fear of counter-offensives by the Ukrainian army, that led to Russia starting peace talks. Only Russia's demilitarization became their main reason. If Russia had a lot of weapons and equipment, it would never agree to peace and would continue to advance as long as it could. Peace talks are a sign of the completion of Russia's demilitarization. This means that it is no longer able to advance. Also, Ukrainians are better motivated, they are defending and liberating their country from the invasion of Dagestan and its army of orcs. And what is the motivation of the Russian occupiers? To get a toilet or used underwear on Ukrainian territory again. Apparently, on Russian territory, this is a luxury. Since Russian soldiers, during the invasion, massively took it out of Ukraine to Russian territory. What else can wild orcs take from Ukraine to their Dagestan? And they took away literally everything they could. Car tires, household appliances, even food, canned goods. Everything that these wild orcs found in the houses of Ukrainians, then they took it all to the nearest post office and sent it home to their relatives. As an example, the photo shows you one of the post offices in Belarus. From there, Russian soldiers sent the loot they had stolen during the invasion of the Kiev region. This is when the Russian army tried to capture Kiev. A similar situation was all over Ukraine, where the Russian army was advancing. It even got to the point that cast iron bathtubs were sent by mail. At the same time, the Russian occupiers constantly told the Ukrainians, why do they live so well and have so much new stuff? Household appliances, modern clothes, electronics, etc. A normal civilized person would not do such things. That is why in Ukraine and the world they began to call them orcs from the wild or Kostan. It is noteworthy that a similar situation was typical for earlier wars of Russia with other countries and peoples. This happened in Georgia and Chechnya, etc. Then it happened in Ukraine. Just on a larger scale. Robbery and looting also became the calling card of the Russian army. And the whole world saw it. Russia unleashed the Russian-Ukrainian War and was defeated in it. And the continuation of the war led to the continuation of the demilitarization of Russia. And production on the territory of Russia and its allies turned out to be unable to provide the required amount of weapons, equipment and ammunition that the Russian Federation spent to continue its war in Ukraine. In addition, under the sanctions, it became much more difficult and expensive for Russia and its allies to produce weapons. And the economy of the Russian Federation began to crack at the seams, expecting another crisis. So, sooner or later, the military component will be on Ukraine's side. And Russia, on the contrary, will be hit by a powerful economic crisis. And then no one will talk to anyone or negotiate. Ukraine will simply take back its territories by force. And Russia will retreat in disgrace. But this is the path of great losses on both sides. Therefore, in order to avoid great losses and disgrace to the Russian army, Russia could cede the southern regions of Ukraine it occupied and retreat. In this case, a freeze of the war is still possible. And then, there will be an economic collapse on the territory of the Russian Federation and it will no longer have time for Ukraine. Russia will leave Ukraine with less disgrace. All this will be presented as an exit from Ukraine for economic reasons. But not as a military defeat in the war. Although in fact this is what will happen, because the economic crisis will be caused precisely by the war against Ukraine and sanctions against Russia for unleashing it. But such a scenario would give both countries the opportunity to avoid great losses. That is why this war has become a real catastrophe for the Russian Federation. After all, now any scenario for its end and the future of Russia in general will have catastrophic consequences for Moscow. That's all I have. Special thanks from the author to everyone who helps the channel. Your help is very important. Like, comment and subscribe to the channel, where many more interesting videos await you. Thanks for watching. And see you soon with new videos. Peace and goodness to all.